The date is the 2nd of May 1536, and Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, has been arrested here at the incredibly grand palace of Placentia. Today, nearly 500 years later, this palace no longer exists, but it and Henry's hunting grounds once stood on this land. So let's explore what these walls saw. The day before Anne's arrest, she was attending a jousting tournament to celebrate May Day, when her husband, King Henry VIII, abruptly left without saying goodbye to her. Little did she know that this would be the last time that she would ever see him. Henry was heading to the city of Westminster, in what is now central London. Rather than take the usual method of a barge to the palace there, Henry VIII rode by horse, bringing along his close friend and member of his inner circle, Henry Norris. This was not for a leisurely journey and social chit-chat, but instead to question his friend, as he'd been implicated in either covering up a supposed affair between Anne and a court musician, or having an affair with Queen Anne himself. Norris denied both knowledge of any affair as well as the idea that he himself was having an affair with her. The day after his questioning, he was arrested anyway and was sent to the Tower of London as a prisoner, joining Mark Smeaton, the accused musician that he'd been questioned about. Smeaton had been questioned, likely under extreme psychological pressure, for nearly a full day before confessing to having an affair with Anne. This confession is thought to be the reason for Henry VIII leaving the jousting tournament early, with Norris in tow. On the banks of where the Palace of Placentia once stood, you can still see some original Tudor wood that was once holding up the pier that the Tudors used to access the barges on the river. The day of Anne's arrest, she would have walked down this pontoon, taking the barge from Greenwich to the Tower of London. This is the same route she'd taken 3 years earlier, under the very different circumstances of celebrating her coronation. She was held in the royal apartments, surrounded by attendants appointed by Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, rather than her usual ladies-in-waiting. These women had been employed by him to spy on Anne and report back on anything she discussed with them. Anne reportedly told one of the spying attendants that on the 30th of April, in public at Greenwich Palace, Anne had asked Henry Norris why he had postponed his marriage, before she accused him of doing so because he was in love with her, and that if the king was not around, he would want to marry her instead. In response, Norris denied this, but Anne had put themselves in a difficult situation, not only for publicly accusing a man of wanting to marry her if the king died, but also just for mentioning the idea of the king's death, as under the 1351 statute of treason, this was a punishable offence. When Anne was initially questioned, she was only questioned on her supposed adultery with 3 men, but in the end, 5 men would stand trial: Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn, Anne's older brother. The Tudor court worked very differently from the courts of today. Anne and the men would have not known what they were being charged with until they were in court standing trial, where they then, on the spot, would have to defend themselves. On top of this, because they were on trial for treason, they had to do all of that without even a defence counsel to help them. To add more to an already impossible task, to be found not guilty in the Tudor court, the defendant had to somehow prove that they were innocent, rather than the prosecution needing to prove that the defendants are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. At trial, Smeaton was the only one of the 5 men to plead guilty to adultery, but even he pled not guilty to the treason charge of plotting or imagining the king's death. At trial, Anne found out that she was being charged with not only adultery and treason, but also incest, to which she pled not guilty to all charges as well. So was Anne guilty of adultery, incest, or treason? Most historians believe this was a scam trial, as there's no real evidence that she was guilty of her charges. Anne was intelligent and had courted Henry for 7 years and insisted that they had to be married for them to be able to consummate their relationship. So why would she risk her life, status, and safety of herself and her daughter on cheating with multiple men? Additionally, Anne was a religious person, and she professed her innocence twice under oath, something that if she was lying, she would have believed would send her to hell. Upon hearing that Smeaton, the only man to confess, continued to plead guilty to adultery even at his death, Anne is reported to have said, "Alas, I fear that his soul will suffer punishment for his false confession." In terms of the actual charges against Anne, historian Eric Ives found that 13 of the 20 incidents literally couldn't have happened, as Anne or the accused man were not at the locations of the incidents on or near those dates. Some of these dates were only 4 to 5 weeks after Anne had given birth to Elizabeth, which was likely during the time period where Anne was still in confinement, recovering from the birth. There's also the argument that these holes were done on purpose to allow for the case to collapse if Henry changed his mind. Within less than 2 weeks of her arrest, Anne was standing trial in court. More than 2,000 people came to watch, with special stands being erected especially for the trial. By this point, all the accused men, except George Boleyn, had stood trial and been found guilty, despite, as described by an eyewitness, giving wise and discreet answers to her accusers as though she was not actually guilty. Anne was still found guilty of all charges of adultery, treason, and incest, and was sentenced to the usual punishment for this crime for a woman. being burnt alive. George Boleyn stood trial next and met the same fate as the other 4 men he was found guilty too. Henry had the 5 men and Anne's sentences converted to beheadings, with a swordsman specially brought over from Calais to perform the execution of Anne. When talking about her beheading, Anne said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck," and she put her hands around her throat and burst out laughing. By her execution date, Anne Boleyn would technically no longer be queen, as her marriage to Henry was declared null and void. The reasons given to have this approved are not clear, but could be linked to Anne's unofficial betrothal in her early 20s to another man. This annulment made the concept of the trial bizarre. If Anne was not and had never been Henry's wife, then how did she commit adultery? The true intentions of the annulment were likely to make their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate, like had happened to Henry's first daughter Mary when his marriage to Catherine of Aragon fell apart, the aim likely being to prevent her and her supporters being able to challenge the succession of any of the king's future children. Little did either of them know that both Mary and Elizabeth would still go on to become the first queens of England to rule in their own right. On Friday the 19th of May, just over 2 weeks from the jousting tournament where everything still appeared to be fine, Anne wore a black dress with a short white fur cloak, walking up the steps of the specially constructed scaffold to her death. Her speech to the large crowd has many versions, but one of the most famous goes as follows. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and a sovereign lord. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me, to God I commend my soul." No matter how Anne felt internally, those in attendance said she appeared brave and composed the whole time she was on the scaffold. After her speech, she knelt down and was blindfolded, with the swordsman cleanly striking her head from her body in one blow. Some of Anne's usual ladies-in-waiting had been present at the scaffold and brought her body to the chapel of St. Peter's Advincula, which is the chapel inside the walls of the Tower of London. It's been heavily remodeled since then, but you can still visit Anne's grave, which now stands at the altar there. So, as Anne was likely innocent of her charges, why and how had it gotten to this conclusion? In the time leading up to Anne's brutal end, Henry's eyes had wandered to Jane Seymour, so Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief advisor, knew he was unofficially in charge of ending Henry's marriage to Anne, so that he could instead marry Jane. Cromwell would have also been well aware of the consequence of failing this task, as one of the previous men to hold his job, Cardinal Wolsey, had at least in part been executed for failing to get an annulment from the Pope for Henry VIII's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Despite what he did to get rid of Anne, Cromwell would still eventually meet the same fate, and 4 years later was executed in part for the failure of Henry VIII's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves. So, why couldn't Henry have just annulled their marriage, considering he did that in the end anyway? Some historians have argued that Henry wanted to make sure he didn't repeat the last 7 years of Catherine of Aragon's life, of having an ex-wife that could gain supporters. Although Catherine was a princess of Spain by birth and aunt to the Holy Roman Emperor, which is nowhere near the influence that the Boleyns held. It's also believed that Henry thought that the lack of male living heir from Anne proved that their marriage had not been lawful in the eyes of God, and so wanted to make sure his next marriage had no doubts over its legitimacy, so that a male heir could be produced, and that in order to do that, Anne couldn't be alive. But did Henry at least believe the accusations against Anne, or did he just purely want her gone so that he can marry Jane? We'll never really know, but Henry and Jane Seymour married only 11 days after Anne's execution, and later that year it's reported that she tried to persuade Henry to restore the abbeys that he'd begun to dissolve. In response, Henry told her not to meddle with his affairs, as look what happened to Anne when she did, suggesting that, at least by that point, he didn't totally think that Anne was guilty of what she was accused of and executed over. If you enjoyed hearing about what these walls saw, please consider subscribing to see more. I post under 3-minute long shorts regularly and plan to post more long videos in the future.